I see way too many DMOs get a little too focused on, we've got our city boundary, we've got our county boundary. We can't promote anything outside that. We shouldn't even talk to those people over there. And it's like the Hatfields and McCoys, and you are stronger together. Visitors do not care about geopolitical boundaries.
You guys, I have been working on something for the last 6 months that has been such a giant project, but I'm so proud of it. I'm excited to announce that I've just released my book. It's called Touch Points, and it's the Destination Marketer's Guide to Brand Evaluation and Enhancement. And it is a comprehensive guide for destinations to look at their brand, evaluate what you've done, and make a very clear and detailed plan of action of how to fix it. And look, I'm biased, right? Because I wrote it, but I think it's so good. I think it's a great guide, and I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. And I wanted to tell you guys about it. It's available on Amazon. Search Touch Points by Adam Stoker, and you'll be able to get that book for your destination. And I think it's going to be, especially for anyone that is trying to look at their brand holistically, this is the book for you. So check it out. Welcome again, everybody, to another episode of the Destination Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Stoker, and just so everybody knows, I'm a little bit under the weather here, so you may hear some sniffles, you may hear some coughs, but I'll do my very best to keep it out of the microphone as best I can. We have a great show for you today, and I'm really excited to have our guest on today. His name is Matthew Landkamer, and he's from the Coraggio Group. And Matthew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, we're excited to have you on. We got a lot to talk about today, Matthew.
Great.
All right, let's dive in. We've got this little icebreaker question that we do every time we have somebody come on the show. We want to know, if you could go anywhere in the world, Matthew, where would it be?
So I actually have a new answer for this. Just in the last couple of weeks, I was at the Outlook Forum recently that Visit California puts on every year. And there was a speaker.
Our media director was down there.
I met her there, actually. We exchanged business cards.
You met Sasha, huh?
I did. Oh,
good.
She was kind enough to introduce herself.
Great. Yeah, she's awesome.
And it's a wonderful conference. It's an amazing conference every year. But the speaker was from Slovenia. Her name was Jana, and she's from an organization called Good Place. She was speaking on their sustainability initiatives and how they've vetted a bunch of sort of programs for their accommodations to get certified as sustainable and that sort of thing. It was really interesting talk, but man, the images she was showing of that place, I'm super intrigued now.
Slovenia, huh?
Slovenia, yeah.
Okay, where even is Slovenia?
It's next door to Austria, and they've got just a little bit of coastline. I think she said 50 kilometers. And it's both, so it's got both coast and it's got these sort of amazing mountainous forests, and it just looks beautiful. I need to learn more, but this is my new fascination.
Yeah, this is fresh, right? We got to dive in and do some research, but you saw some images that made you want it, huh?
Exactly.
So what would the answer have been before the Outlook Forum?
I might have been Japan. I'm a potter in my spare time.
A potter?
A potter.
Okay.
And there's an amazing pottery tradition in Japan, and an artist I'm particularly fond of, James Turrell, helped design a lodge, I believe it's in northern Japan, that I would love to see as well. So I'm fascinated by Japanese culture and, the sort of amazing urban density of places like Tokyo. I'd love to see that. But there's also some more rustic, rural parts of Japan that I'd really like to see as well. So that might have been my answer, if not Slovenia.
Yeah, I've got to get you and Colby together. My business partner, Colby, spent a couple years in Japan, and he loves Japan. You guys could probably catch up for quite a while about that, but he'll tell you the places to go.
All right.
Awesome. Well, okay, let's talk places you've been, Matthew. What's your favorite destination you've ever visited? And just know that it can't be a client. That way we're not offending anybody.
Well, I'm gonna kind of go around the edge of the client piece.
Okay, that's fair.
Because the place isn't a direct client, but it's where I have to go to meet this client.
Okay.
And this is just, you're asking me today. If you ask me a month from now, it's probably something else. But right now, I am fascinated with Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Really?
Yeah, it's, I'll be honest, a big part of it's food. I have fallen in love with New Mexican cuisine, and every time I'm down there, I just eat way too much.
I have clearly gone to the wrong places when I've driven through New Mexico. I've never gone on a vacation in New Mexico, so I don't want to criticize the New Mexico dining experience, but I've driven through several times and never stopped at the right place. So I'm glad to hear this. I need to try this next time I'm in town.
I can give you some recommendations for sure. I've got my favorites. But it's also, you may not know this, Santa Fe is the third largest art market in the United States, behind New York and Los Angeles, which is really unexpected. But there is a huge amount of, and a huge range of art that is on display and for sale and in museums. I've only been able to sort of scratch the surface. I did bring home a piece of pottery from last time I was there, but it's got just amazing cultural assets, that amazing cuisine, and this really interesting sort of historic feel to the downtown that's unlike anything else.
Well, surprisingly enough, I've actually heard how amazing the art scene in Santa Fe is. I think I had a neighbor that would go down there on an annual basis, and they told me about it. And man, it sounds like a pretty awesome experience, especially for someone like you who's really into art.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're into art and food, it's a pretty special place to go.
It's the right place. Okay. That's good to know. Tell me, we don't normally go this far into this, but you fascinated me here. So tell me a little bit about, you're a potter. How does one get into pottery?
Quite accidentally. I have an art degree. That was what I studied in college. And I had a really pretty successful painting career for 20 years or so. And I my joke is I painted myself into a corner. I took the work to a place where I didn't know where to go next with it. And I kind of paused. And at about that time, I took a pottery class with my daughter, trying to get her interested in pottery. I just thought it'd be fun. I got hooked. Cool. Because I was sort of paused on painting. It sort of filled that void really quickly, and ended up buying myself a pottery wheel and a kiln and all that kind of stuff. So,
no way.
Yeah, so it's a long detour from painting. I think painting will come back, but right now I'm a potter.
Wow, that's really cool. And you made the natural transition. This is where we'll kind of get into your background. Natural transition from art and pottery into consulting for travel and tourism destinations. Yeah. It's a really common career path. I find a lot of management consultants have fine art degrees. We get a lot of potters on the show here.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah. It's one of those things you never know where your life's going to take you. So art background. I was working for an art supply company a long time ago and fell backwards into a marketing role. And so then I had this marketing career and did marketing for different kinds of companies over time, and ended up at a company, an architecture firm in Seattle, that hired Coraggio Group to come help them do an integrated plan across their 7 or 8 market types and their global offices. And I managed the project on the side for that architecture firm, and got to know Coraggio. I was really impressed by the people I was working with, really liked them. And watching what they did, I was just like, I got to do that. So here I am 7 years later, wow, working as a management consultant with a fine art degree. Yeah.
That's great. Okay. Tell me where you're originally from, Matthew.
Grew up in Nebraska.
What part?
Lincoln. Capital city.
Lincoln, Nebraska. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Did you go to the University of Nebraska?
I did not. I went to one of the other universities in town, Nebraska Wesleyan University.
Nice. Okay.
Shout out to the Prairie Wolves. Yeah.
That's right. I've only gone to Lincoln, Nebraska one time, and it was when Brigham Young University played Nebraska several years ago, and we won on a last second Hail Mary crazy play. It was like one of the most euphoric fan experiences I've ever had, but I'm sure Nebraska fans didn't feel the same way.
Probably not, but to beat Nebraska in Memorial Stadium is something, I'm sure.
It was pretty wild. Okay, today is the day of tangents apparently, so sorry about that. Let's get back into our destination marketing podcast here.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about the Coraggio Group and what got you from management consultant in the Coraggio Group to leading out on tourism specifically?
Yeah. So Coraggio is a consulting firm based in Portland, Oregon. We've been around for about 15 years. We work across a lot of different sectors and always have. Most of what we do is strategy, but we also do change leadership. We do leadership and culture work, and we do continuous improvement work. But most of the work we do is strategy. And we tend to work with leaders of organizations to really help them set the course for what they need to do. And over time, we've it was like a snowball. We had the first tourism project, it was before I started, I think it was maybe 10 years ago. And that was Joe D'Alessandro, who leads San Francisco Travel now, was up here in Portland. He lived here. He ran the organization that preceded Travel Portland and hired us to do, I think, a strategic plan. And then he referred us to some other people, and they referred us to some other people. And now, all these years later, travel and tourism is about half of our work. It's the most significant sector we work in by far, and the one we put the most emphasis on. And I, did work in a lot of different sectors, including tourism work. But when we decided, hey, this thing is really getting kind of big, and we need to really sort of pay attention to this, the owners of the company asked me if I would lead the travel and tourism practice. So I'm fortunate enough to have who can complain about that job, right? So that's I happily said yes, and that's where I am.
Great. And when you and I did our intro call a couple of weeks ago, we really talked about the different things that you've worked on in travel and tourism. And one of the things that really stood out to me was stakeholder engagement. You guys do a lot of work with destinations to make sure that they're doing a good job with stakeholder engagement. And in my opinion, stakeholder engagement has a tendency to get a little bit neglected because we're all just deep into it, right, in the day-to-day. And sometimes we forget to let our stakeholders know what's happening, why is it good for them, what are we doing with their tax dollars. So tell me a little bit about your philosophy on stakeholder engagement and why it's so important for destinations. And then we'll go into the rural side of it.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about stakeholders in the broadest sense. I think you could arguably say the people most close in to a DMO are really important stakeholders. But I think it's also important to go beyond them. So for many DMOs, that immediate stakeholder group may be hoteliers who may be collecting an assessment that funds your DMO. You may have a board that you answer to, and of course, they're very important stakeholders. But we also think about other partners in the community, city government or other industry groups maybe that exist in the place, or the Chamber of Commerce or Downtown Association. And we think about residents in a lot of cases because increasingly, this, resident opinion and resident sentiment is a big driver of the politics that happen around tourism and funding for tourism organizations. And so doing the work to make sure you're hearing from that broad constituency is, I think, essential to being an effective DMO these days, and to sort of play defense in a way to make sure that nothing surprises you. There isn't some political upswell that catches you off guard. And there's a lot of good ideas out there. And if you're open to hearing some of the thoughts from your community, sometimes there's some really brilliant stuff that comes out of that.
I want to dive a little deeper in just a minute on how, right? How to hear what they have to say and how to collect that information. But before we do, you mentioned that rural destinations specifically, in most cases, need a lot of work on stakeholder engagement. So tell me why you kind of zeroed in on rural and what separates that from maybe more of an urban destination.
Yeah. So we see this everywhere, at least everywhere we work. There's a rural-urban divide when it comes to tourism. And there's often this sort of this feeling in the more rural areas of being left out. And I want to give credit where credit is due. I think they're probably right in a lot of cases. They don't get promoted as much maybe because there may be a more urban area that's driving more of the visitation. And it becomes a sort of unbreakable cycle of they don't get the attention, and so they don't generate as much money, so they don't get the attention. And so there's some resentment that builds up a lot of times, and people in these rural areas feel like they've been overlooked. And I think there's also sometimes a little less, let's call it readiness for tourism in rural areas. And doing the due diligence to do the stakeholder engagement can help set the stage for a greater acceptance of tourism as a potential economic driver. So if you're in a rural place that's transitioning from some sort of extraction economy that's going away, that's reducing quickly, and you've got people saying, well, we can do tourism as another economic development driver, sometimes that's met with some skepticism. And doing deliberate stakeholder engagement is a two-way conversation. So yes, you're gathering input from these folks, you're making sure they feel heard and they're part of the conversation and their opinions are important. And at the same time, you're sharing information with them. And you're hopefully helping to shape their thinking about the potential for tourism to be an economic driver for their place.
Yeah, I've talked a lot about the show about stakeholder engagement from the perspective of educating stakeholders on what's happening. I haven't talked a lot about collecting information from your stakeholders. So tell me a little bit about your recommended process and methodology for listening.
Yeah. So one of the first things I'll say is it's multimodal. You definitely need to go do some in-person listening, do as much as you can, but you also want to employ surveys, maybe focus groups, some telephone interviews, and you get different kinds of information out of these different modalities. Surveys can give you some nice quantitative data. You might be able to slice it by different areas or different types of businesses or different kinds of stakeholders. And that's nice, but it's good to be able to go deeper by meeting in person with people. And whether that's sort of town hall style, facilitated work sessions, focus groups, interviews, you can get some of the more qualitative stuff. One of the really important things I think that needs to be focused on is go to them. Don't say, hey, we want to hear from folks in rural areas and then hold the meeting in the city. You need to hold the meeting in the rural places and make sure people have a chance to come in their own communities to engage in that conversation.
Right.
I think it's also really important to build representational groups. Do the deliberate outreach to make sure you're getting people from all those constituencies that you need to hear from that I just listed and more. And just being really careful about making sure that that's happening. Any group that might be impacted by positively or negatively by tourism, making sure that you find a way to get them at the table.
Well, Matthew, let me double click on that a little bit. So I've been a part of some of these town hall meetings. It wasn't in tourism. We were actually rebranding a university. It was going from a college to a university. And in the community that we were working with, there were a lot of strong feelings about what should and shouldn't happen. It had somewhat of a controversial name, and there was a lot of feelings on both sides of the name. And sometimes those town hall meetings had a tendency to get a little out of control, and emotions kind of took control of the meeting. And then you've got somewhat of a domino effect of negative comment, negative comment, negative comment. And next thing you know,
right,
the point of the meeting is completely lost, right? So tell me how you, and I know this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but tell me how you moderate a town hall meeting like that when people have strong opinions about whether or not to promote tourism in a destination.
One of my favorite ways to do that is to minimize the amount of time that you have the group speak as a whole. And what that looks like usually is we have the room set up in rounds and we provide exercises for people to do in small groups. We call them game boards, but they're big sheets that go on the table and have different sections in them where we're asking them as a small group to answer different questions. We usually force people to, by the way, sit not with the people they work with. So we're preventing them from sort of ganging up in a way and feeding off each other if there's some people from the same organization who maybe have an axe to grind. Yeah. But also by keeping it in small groups, one of those groups may get dominated a bit, but you're not going to have the whole room dominated in the same way by, call it a squeaky wheel.
Yeah.
So keeping the conversation smaller is one of the big things. I
really like that because what you do is you allow everyone to be heard in a large format, but the conversation stays small. I really like that methodology.
It minimizes grandstanding. And it also maximizes the amount people are able to talk. If you've got 30 people in a room and you divide them into 5 groups, everybody just got that much more time to talk versus being one of 30. Now they're one of 6. So that's pretty significant too. It allows you to get more voices. You have to have a good methodology for capturing all that and synthesizing it into something meaningful, but it really does help with that sort of public meeting challenge that you just identified.
Makes sense. Totally makes sense. Okay. What mistakes do you see destinations make when they're attempting to do the right thing, which is engage their stakeholders? What's the wrong way to do it?
So 2 things come to mind right away. One is they are way more interested in just telling the stakeholders about what they're doing and what they think than they are in listening. I think that balance, it's maybe the 80-20 rule. You need to spend 80% of that time listening and 20% telling them what your plans are, what you're thinking about. So that's easy to do. You're excited. You want to put together a deck. You want to share all this exciting information with everybody. But if you really want to engage stakeholders, they need to do most of the talking. And I think the other one is what happens afterwards.
Got it.
Because a lot of times you'll have some cynics who come to these. And when we talk about cynicism at Coraggio, we joke that it's when it hurts. You care so much that it hurts. It's important to you, and you don't feel like it's living up to your expectations, whatever it is. And that's when you turn cynical. And so when you've got the potential for people to be cynical, you need to be super deliberate about capturing things that you heard from them in a really transparent and accurate way, and reporting back to them after you've gone through some decision-making process to say, we heard you say this, and because of that, we made this decision. We also heard you say this. We considered it. However, because of these other factors, A, B, and C, we weren't able to make that decision. But we want you to know that we heard you, and we think that's really important feedback. It just didn't work this time. And if you don't do that kind of deliberate feedback to folks, it's really easy for people to think it was all just a sham.
Yeah, they feel like it's a dog and pony show at that point.
Exactly. But and you don't have to do this for everything you heard. If you just pick a few really key things and you communicate really clearly, we heard you, and here's the decisions we made and why. And in my experience, even people who disagree with the decision that was made can at least understand and say, well, I got a chance to give my voice. They ended up not going that way, but I feel like I was heard.
Got it.
Okay. And that's easy to skip. It's really easy to forget that piece. And I just think that's the most important thing.
Oh, it is, because you've got the information you need to make decisions, right? And so you're like, okay, let's get going. Let's do it. But you don't let the people that you collected the information from know, hey, my voice actually made a difference or made sense. And so it's kind of a forgettable piece, but like you say, critical for stakeholders to feel involved.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay. Let me kind of ask you, without giving away anything proprietary, right? Because I don't want you to go too far into this, but tell me a couple of other best practices for destinations who want to do a better job of stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, one thing that I would definitely recommend is finding ways to make the engagement creative and interesting. One thing, just to give you an example, I'm going to use this next week, I think, with a client. Sometimes we want to hear from stakeholders, how would you prioritize investment around this thing? And so what we'll do is we'll bring monopoly money and we'll give everybody $100 in different denominations and say, here's the buckets. How would you spend it? And they put their money in the buckets, and then we can total that up and sort of see where the group's preferences are. You could do that in a really basic way and say, hey, rank these 1 to 5, right? But when you put fake money in their hands and you connect it to investment, it makes it a little more, it makes it feel a little more real. They're making more of a decision to prioritize these things.
Right.
And it makes it feel creative. And so if you can do a variety of large group and small group exercises, things that get people on their feet, things that get people doing something creative, and then do some of the more standard, hey, I'm going to ask questions and write your answers on a flip chart. Just mixing it up is so important to keep people engaged, especially if these meetings are longer, if they're a couple hours or more. You really have to mix it up or people just check out, start looking at their cell phones,
Yeah. And I know I've got some listeners that are a little bit jaded in their communities right now and saying, yeah, I've tried to do stuff like this in the past and nobody showed up, or I had 3 people show up. So what's your process also for getting people to this event or this session or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, most often we rely on the DMOs to do that. And some of it is just the due diligence of asking multiple times to get people to agree to do it.
Yeah.
There have been times, though, that we will incentivize it for in one way or another, give people an incentive to come. And it doesn't have to be big, but it does have to be meaningful. And that works. I think another thing, depending on your community and sort of what needs are, if you're trying to get people to come to something that's maybe an evening event, if you can provide food, just have pizzas there. If you can provide childcare, doing those sorts of things that make it easy for people to say yes, versus you're just asking to take time out of their lives. They've got to find a babysitter. They're going to have to do this meeting through dinner and be hungry. If you can take those relatively low-cost things and make it easy for them to say yes, I think that makes a huge difference.
Totally makes sense. Yep. The power of food is immeasurable.
Yeah.
Okay, so you subscribe to the collective impact model. For those of us who, don't just have all these models visualized in our heads, tell us a little bit about the collective impact model and why you choose to subscribe to it.
Yeah. This is a recommendation that we make for implementation of strategies of one sort or another. So whether you're talking about a DMO's strategic plan, or whether you're talking about a destination's long-term destination stewardship plan, you need to move into some implementation. And if you're doing that with stakeholders, you need a governance model that will sort of guide the way you come together and move forward to make some changes together. So we took this model out of the nonprofit world called the collective impact model that was developed to bring multiple nonprofits together to accomplish a common goal. And there's a great example right here in Portland, Oregon, an organization called All Hands Raised, which is an education initiative. And they've identified some common goals that they're working with a whole range of nonprofits around. So just to give you an example, there's some research that shows, I'm going to get this probably wrong, so listeners, if you know more than I do, forgive me. But it's something along the lines of, if you can get kids reading at grade level by third grade, if they're meeting sort of the standard at third grade, their chances of graduation go way up. And their chances of academic success go way up. So All Hands Raised has a series of metrics like that they're focused on, and they've got nonprofits from all over the place. So yes, there's education nonprofits in there, but there's also early childhood development nonprofits. There's nutrition nonprofits because, hungry kids can't learn well. And all these other actors that are in sort of peripheral spaces who come together under this All Hands Raised banner to collectively impact these things that will make education in Portland more effective. And makes, help students be more academically successful. So this model involves a structured process that has some common elements. So you need a common agenda. You need to say, this is the thing that we organizations are trying to accomplish together. Things like that third grade reading level and others. Shared measurement. So these are how we're going to measure success together. Really good communication. Mutually reinforcing activities. So that's, this organization does this to contribute. This other organization does another thing that contributes to the same thing. We recognize we have other missions too, but this one thing we do is contributing into this. And when you bring all these things together with a backbone organization, somebody who's going to drive the center of this, you can have this really powerful impact that's much bigger than any of these actors could do on their own. So taking that model from the nonprofit world then and applying it in the travel and tourism space, if you think of a DMO as the backbone organization for a collective impact model, they and their plan can sort of set that common agenda and set the measures of success, but then they can bring these other partner organizations together, those chambers and those restaurant associations and those downtown associations and the city government, and talk about what their mutually reinforcing efforts are and what their continuous communications look like, and set some targets together and really work in concert to move things forward a lot more quickly than the DMO would ever be able to do by itself.
Okay. Let's talk success then. Tell me one of the destinations that you've seen implement something like this and what they saw and what the results were.
Well, that's kind of a tricky question right now because this is kind of a new thing for us. We've been using this, applying this to travel and tourism now for about a year. So we're not very far into how has this played out?
Got it.
This is a theoretical application of this model that we've become familiar with. Now, I will say, we have some clients using it. Beverly Hills is a great example. We did a destination development plan for Beverly Hills, destination management plan, excuse me. And the city bought into the process as well. They were at the table. The mayor was part of the planning team. They were very bought in. So it was this shared responsibility between the Beverly Hills CVB and the city. And they're using the collective impact model as their framework for implementation, but they're just getting started. So,
awesome.
Yeah, and there's some other destinations as well. I'm really looking forward to see how this plays out. I think it's got a lot of potential, but we haven't been able to measure it yet.
Yeah, and I want to make sure our audience understands too, like the impact of this type of a model or implementation. This is not a 12-month, let's look at the results. The results of this can happen over 3, 5, 10 years, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, maybe we'll have to do a follow-up episode with the Hollywood experiment, or excuse me, the Beverly Hills experiment there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about, like, I'm a destination. I haven't hired a consultancy or anything like that. How do I measure whether or not I'm doing a good job of stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, and it's tricky. I think there's 2 ways you can do it. One is the sort of gut check, make a checklist of things that you want to feel like stakeholders are bought into, and sort of test yourself against those. Are we seeing good response anecdotally from the team? What are we hearing from stakeholders? Are they more engaged in this than they used to be? But I think if you want to get a little more deliberate about it, I think an annual survey of your stakeholders is a really good idea. It's that continuous touch point of, hey, are we doing a good job? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of? Do you have ideas for us? Where do you see upcoming challenges? And just keeping them engaged. Doesn't have to be a long survey. This could be a 5-minute deal. And just doing that once a year and tracking your numbers over time. And it could be as simple as a satisfaction score too. How satisfied are you with our DMO and the work we're doing in the community?
Yeah.
But it's tracking it over time and measuring progress is just super important. And I think a survey is a great way to do that.
Yeah, I like the idea of the annual survey. And for those that are listening, when was the last time you surveyed your stakeholders? And I love how you said keep it simple and just say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with the work we're doing? And then as a follow-up to that, where do you think we can improve? And those 2 questions alone are going to give you an incredible amount of usable information, right?
Yes, usable information, and as important, it's going to give you goodwill with your stakeholder community.
That's right. Of course, you can't forget the piece of, okay, we heard you, here's the changes we're making as a result, right? You can't just ask for it and then go dark, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So I'm a destination. I start doing the survey. I start actioning on some of these things. How long should I go with attempting to improve my stakeholder engagement before I start saying, is this working? I know it's a very abstract question here, right? Sorry, Matthew.
Yeah, no. I was just going to say, I think stakeholder engagement is professional purgatory. And once you start it, you need to do it forever.
Right.
And hopefully you're getting good results and you're seeing higher engagement numbers and higher satisfaction scores or whatever it may be from your community. But I don't think you can ever stop engaging your stakeholders. It may morph over time. It may change as you build more trust. You may be able to engage them in different ways. For instance, if you're having a hard time getting people to come to meetings, but you start off with survey and they start to see success over time, maybe then that trust's built, and their view of your success may lead them to be more willing to come to meetings over time. Yeah. So you may be able to deepen it, but I don't think you can ever call it done.
Right. And you mentioned early on that you can't just look at stakeholders in one bucket. You need to kind of segment them into, I've got my political stakeholders, I've got my residents within the community, and separate those out. I've got the hotels and the restaurants and all that type of thing. But the harsh reality here with stakeholder engagement is if you're not gathering information from your stakeholders and informing them of what's going on, and you neglect it, there's a lot of destinations right now that are experiencing real heartache on the political side because they've gone years of neglecting the engagement that needs to happen with their stakeholders. And all of a sudden, you get a politician or a commissioner or a city council person that doesn't like what you're doing because you haven't kept them informed. And suddenly it's the platform for their campaign and you lose your funding,
Yeah. I want to give you an example, a recent example, and I'm not going to name names on this one.
Okay.
But a DMO that we work with did a pretty massive public survey as part of another planning process they were doing. And they found that something like 80% of their community members sort of embrace tourism and think it's great for the community and it's good for the economy. And when you talk to their stakeholder group, those folks really think the community has a lot of heartburn about tourism. And their perception is that there's just a lot of pushback and a lot of people are pretty upset about it. And it's that squeaky wheel that is making a big impression on these stakeholders who are paying attention. And because they see it, it becomes this sort of pattern recognition thing where they see it, it gives them some anxiety, which makes them pay more attention to it, and they see it more. And so they think there's this community uprising against tourism when the objective numbers from a survey that's not even a year old say, no, by and large, our community really embraces tourism.
Right.
So you need to be careful about that too. Yes, we're seeing a lot of pushback, and those politicians can be the ones, and the policymakers can be the ones who get that sort of biased view of how the community really feels because they're hearing some really focused voices that have maybe a big megaphone. So part of it is, how do you get that bigger voice so that you can counteract that message and say, yes, I know you're hearing from some people who are upset about these things. Here's a lot of evidence that there's a lot of people who are not and who really depend on this and understand the benefits it brings to our community.
Right. Well, this is good stuff, Matthew. I think, we've just scratched the surface today on stakeholder engagement. I think there's a whole lot more. We could probably do a 2-hour episode on this. We won't, but we probably could. But I do want to, before we let you go, I do want to ask you, is there anything I haven't asked you that if you could tell every destination listening, what do they need to know? If you could boil it down into a takeaway, what is it?
Ooh. I think I'm shooting from the hip here, Adam, but I think I would
no problem.
I would say be inclusive. And when I say that, I mean be inclusive beyond geopolitical borders. I see way too many DMOs get a little too focused on, we've got our city boundary, we've got our county boundary. We can't promote anything outside that. We shouldn't even talk to those people over there. And it's like the Hatfields and McCoys. And you are stronger together. Visitors do not care about geopolitical boundaries at all, generally, unless they're at Four Corners. I think that's the one place maybe where it matters. Then it's cool. But, I just think it's a real easy pitfall. And it's to everybody's benefit to work across those boundaries as much as you can. So when you're doing engagement, engage beyond those sort of self-imposed boundaries that you've made. And maybe it's geopolitical, maybe it's something else, but think bigger than maybe what you typically do, and how inclusive can you be when you do this engagement?
I'm so glad you say that. And the thing that stood out to me is the visitor does not care where the city line or the county line or anything else is. They just want to have a great trip.
Exactly. And if you can bring visitors together, it's going to benefit both.
Absolutely. Well, Matthew, this has been great. Thanks so much for taking the time and for sharing some of your knowledge with us today.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
If somebody wants to find you, where do they need to go?
CoraggioGroup.com. That's 1R, 2 Gs, Coraggio group.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on, and we appreciate it.
All right. I appreciate it as well. And Adam, I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, this has been another wonderful episode of the Destination Marketing Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't left us a rating or a review, don't forget, it just takes the click of a button and it really helps us continue to have our snowball of momentum grow and continue to be found among other destinations. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.